Okay, so I'm going to start recording, and then hopefully everyone can see my slides. So as I mentioned, we'll be doing some consent training, and then we'll have a little study update, and then a chance for any sort of questions related to any aspects of the study. So just a reminder of the definition of consent. It's a process by which the subject voluntarily confirms their willingness to participate in a clinical trial, after having been informed of all aspects of the trial and the documentation of this consent on a form and within records as well. So the topics that we will be covering will be things like roles, the consent process, subject capacity, documentation requirements, and any sort of procedures that are needed at site. A bit about retrospective consent, and then we'll go through some common mistakes and corrections that we often see with the consent forms or documentation process. And then a little bit about withdrawal of consent and how we do the entries on the ECRF. And we'll then just touch upon a few documents, and then going on to the questions and study updates. So here is a table of the roles involved in consent. So we obviously have the patient or subject who is going to be involved in the study, or a study participant of the study. We have the investigator, who is a staff member delegated with responsibilities of obtaining the informed consent. We have the personal legal representative, who is usually a friend or partner or relative of the patient, and a person that is not connected to the study in any way, and willing to give consent on the patient's behalf. We also have the professional legal representative, who is usually a doctor, responsible for the medical treatment of the patient, but independent of the study, so therefore not listed on the delegation log. For REMAP CAP, we also allow matrons to be a professional legal representative, and this was sort of an update that we had a couple of amendments ago. We have the impartial witness, who is required in some methods of obtaining consent. Again, this would be a person who is independent of the trial and not unfairly influenced by anyone involved in the trial, and usually somebody like a patient, visitor, or an independent nurse. So going on to when consent is taken, we always try to take prospective consent obtained from the patient prior to the start of screening activities, and this is the sort of default consent type. We then have deferred consent, which is consent obtained on behalf of the patient from a personal legal representative or a professional legal representative, when the patient is not capable of providing consent themselves. And again, this would be prior to screening activities. If for some reason that is not possible, and in an emergency situation where it is still beneficial for the patient to be part of the trial, then we have delayed consent, which again is still consent from the personal legal representative or the professional legal representative, but it would be after the patient has been enrolled and as soon as possible, so ideally within 24 hours. And then we have retrospective consent, which we always aim to gain. So if we do obtain initial deferred consent or delayed consent, we must always try and get a retrospective consent after the patient has regained capacity. So this could be while they're in hospital, or it may be after hospital discharge within their follow-up period. Just a bit more about the consent process and how we should do this. So patient consent, we try to do, we try to take written consent. If that's not possible, we can take verbal consent, which is witnessed, and this would be using the sort of standard patient information sheet and consent form. And this would apply for, if a verbal consent would apply if they can't read or write, or if they're sort of too weak to be able to do that. We can also read the patient information to them, and then sort of just obtain verbal consent. Personal legal representative consent, we have a specific form for that. Again, this can be written or verbal. If it's verbal, it would be witnessed again. If it's a situation where the personal legal representative is overwhelmed or they want you to summarize the information, we also have a summary version of that form. And then we have the professional legal representative consent, which again, we have a separate form for that. And that would only be applied if the personal legal representative was not available. We also have video consent now. We have a video consent form, and so we can take written or verbal witnessed consent using the video consent form. This again would be for when the patient or personal legal representative does not want to read the full PIS, or they're having difficulty digesting the information. And this just makes it a bit easier for them to sort of take in the information. It's important to note that when we do take video consent, we will still always provide a copy of the full PIS and consent form. And I think that is that is stated on the form, the verbal consent, the video consent form, sorry. We also have telephone consent. We have a telephone consent form for this, and this requires a witness. Now, this can be used prospectively if, for example, the patient is not able to give consent, and we want to get it from the personal legal representative, but they're not at the hospital, they may be on their way, and we're having a phone call with them, then we can obtain telephone consent. And it can also apply for when the patient has gained capacity but outside of hospital. So if they gain capacity while they're at home after they've been discharged, and we still haven't obtained retrospective consent, then we will try and do this by telephone. It is also good to always follow up the telephone consent with written consent. But as a bare minimum, I think it's always good to try and obtain at least a telephone consent prior to sort of posting out or emailing a written consent form to obtain that retrospectively from the patient. So this is just a flowchart representation of what I've just explained. So written and verbal consent from the patient if possible. If not, then written or verbal consent from a personal legal representative. If that's not possible, then from the professional legal representative. And then always we try to obtain retrospective consent in some form or other, whether it's telephone and then followed up by retrospective written consent. So now I'm going to pass on to Lindsay, who will start off with talking about subject capacity.
Hi. Yeah, this is my part. Hopefully everyone can hear me. It's okay. So when we say the patient is capacitated, we mean that they are competent to provide their own informed consent, whether that's written or verbal. In that case, the regular informed consent process should be conducted, and the patient is enrolled in REMAP CAP only with their own informed consent, so nothing else is needed. But if the patient is incapacitated, which means they're not competent to provide their own informed consent, you should still try to provide information at their level of understanding. So if they have some capacity to understand, you can use the video animation, which has simplified and shorter amount of information, and they can sign the animation consent form. But if not, then you can decide how much information is appropriate to provide based on their situation. And if they don't have capacity, they should be enrolled with a personal legal representative. And if there is no personal legal representative, then with a professional legal representative. So the different consent forms should be signed. And then retrospective consent must be obtained as soon as the patient regains capacity. Some examples of incapacitated patients are those who are very confused or very ill, and vulnerable groups such as minors, elderly, mentally ill or disabled people, and refugees are likely to be incapacitated, but not necessarily. Can move on to the next slide. So for standard written consent, the first step is the interview with the patient or the legal representative. So the investigator or delegate should fully inform the patient or representative of all aspects of the trial, including the written information. So they should be given the informed consent form and be able to read and ask any questions. Before the consent is obtained, so the form is signed, the investigator or delegate should provide the patient or representative with ample time and opportunity to inquire about the details of the trial and to decide whether or not to participate in the trial. And all questions about the trial should be answered to the satisfaction of the patient or representative. Adequate time should be provided for the patient or representative to consider his or her decision. And then once they agree, the written informed consent form should be signed and personally dated by the potential subject or representative and by the person who conducted the informed consent discussion. And in accordance with the international guidelines, the informed consent of a subject should be in writing. When the subject is unable to write, it may be recorded with the signature of an impartial witness. And if this is the case, please include a note that explains this. And after it is signed, the patient and representative should receive a copy of the signed and dated written informed consent form and any other written information. And during a subject's participation in the trial, the subject and representative should receive a copy of any updates to the consent form and any amendments to the written information provided to the subjects. So as you can see on the slide, it's mostly the same process for witnesses. They use the same forms, but they need to sign the witness section of the form as well. And all conversations regarding consent should be documented in the patient notes, or they should be a file note and entered on the ECRF, which is Spinnaker. And please remember that if it's not written down, it didn't happen, and all patients and families must be aware of their inclusion in the trial. We can move on to the next slide. So we need a clear process for the procedures for obtaining informed consent in an emergency setting. Sorry, could we meet the participants? Thank you, Aisha. So during a pandemic, alternative methods of obtaining an informed consent, documenting consent could be used. This could be via video or audio recording. And procedures for documentation of method of consent and completion of consent statement should be clear. And procedures and documentation of checking the validity of legal representatives who sign the consent forms on behalf of patients should also be clear. So you should confirm the person's relationship to the patient and assess if there is a conflict of interest, such as being part of the research project, which is unlikely for personal representatives, but for pro-LRs, so doctors, you should check that they're not on the delegation log for REMAP cap. And in general, for legal representatives, they shouldn't be gaining any financial benefit, or if you feel that they're taking advantage in some way, or you're not sure about you're not sure that they are who they say they are, you can ask for ID. And the timeline for approaching the subject or legal representative for consent, if the patient is initially not capable, should be documented. And please remember that it is a process, not a form, so the informed consent process must always be documented in the patient notes. And as Aisha described, the traditional form is prospective or delayed and deferred consent. And we also have the alternative methods of verbal consent, which can be either in person or over the telephone. And on the slides, We also have the work instruction document, which will be shared with all sites shortly. So in terms of documentation, please include information about who informed the patient or personal or professional representative about the study and when and how that discussion was held. Document the method for obtaining informed consent, including alternative methods. If it's verbal consent, please specify that. Please document confirmation of patient's capacity or incapacity, to what degree and why. This is especially important when the participant is not well enough to complete all fields on the form. When a monitor is checking the notes, they should be able to understand why alternative methods were used. For personal legal representative consent, verification of identity and what their relationship is to the patient should be documented. For professional legal representative, verification that they're not listed on the delegation log and are independent of REMAP cap should be documented. Please also record all attempts made to contact or obtain personal legal representative consent before, and if you couldn't reach a next of kin for the patient, then after pro-LR consent is obtained, you should document any attempts to contact pro-LR as well. And please record all attempts made to obtain retrospective consent, either before or after hospital discharge, up until the day 180 follow-up point. So you can use telephone, post, email to contact the patients. It should be clear from the documentation that the site adhered to site and REMAP cap approved procedures for obtaining informed consent. This should also be included in the SIV report.
I think we just have one question from Ashley Thomas.
Hi, I just wanted to ask how we can, verify the identity of the personal legal representative. Will this involve, including their identifiable details, like their full name in the consent documentation?
So the personal legal representative's full name would be on the personal legal representative consent form. But it's just sort of making sure, or just confirming what the relationship is, and just if you think there's any issues, sort of, noting down what you've done to check. So like we sort of said, if you think they've got financial gain, which I think for this study it doesn't really apply, or if there's any other sort of conflict of interest.
Yeah, things like maybe mentioning that on medical records they are the next of kin of the patient.
Yeah. And I guess if they're not the next of kin, then I don't know, is that because the record isn't up to date or whatever the issue might be?
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
So there are also some additional preferred items in the documentation. So ideally, you should document that the patient or legal representative was able to ask questions to a study investigator. You should document that they were given enough time to consider study participation. You should note which version of the PIS ICF was signed, and also note that the patient or representative was given a copy of the completed PIS ICF. So we ask that the original copy of the consent form is filed in the ISF, one copy is given to the patient, and one copy is filed in medical records. So if you have electronic patient records, you could save a scanned copy on there.
If a professional legal representative has given consent, then you must make attempts to obtain consent from a personal legal representative as soon as possible. And attempts should also be made to obtain consent from the patient if they regain capacity before hospital discharge. So it's best not to wait for the patient to regain capacity, but to try and find try and obtain a personal legal representative in the meantime. You may end up with 3 or 4 signed consent forms for one patient, possibly. If a patient does not regain capacity, attempts must be made to obtain consent after they've been discharged from hospital. This may be in person if they have a follow-up appointment, or it may be by telephone. And as Aisha mentioned earlier, it's best to try and get a verbal consent via telephone prior to following up by sending out a written consent form for a written signature after that. So please try to obtain telephone consent prior to postal written consent, in case this doesn't get returned by the patient, or maybe it even goes missing in being sent. Next slide, please. So in the monitoring that we've done, and quite a lot of this has been for COVID patients, so hopefully the issues won't be quite so complicated going forwards. These are the most common mistakes that we've come across. In the header, there's been quite a few instances of incorrect or missing study details, such as the site name or site number, or the investigator name. Sometimes we've seen the doctor who's been assessing eligibility, their name has been in the header instead of the PI's name, and the patient ID, patient number might also be missing. We've seen boxes down the side for each statement on the consent form being ticked rather than initialed, or even left blank. Sometimes all of them, sometimes a few of them have been left blank. Occasionally a missing signature or a missing date or time next to a signature, or an incorrect date. The patient's name may have been completed at the top of the page incomplete, or as a nickname. There have been times where the latest approved version of the consent documentation hasn't been used, which means that the patient hasn't been getting the most up-to-date information. An original consent form hasn't always been filed in the site file. And again, in COVID, there have been very good reasons for that. But now that we're not in a pandemic situation, those complicated situations shouldn't arise in the same way. And the consent process hasn't always been documented in the medical records. So how to correct each of these? For incorrect information in the study, in the header, please add the information retrospectively, and you can initial and date these changes. If the boxes have been ticked rather than initialed, it would be ideal to reconsent if possible and document attempts to reconsent, or the patient can amend an initial or date if concerning just one box. I suppose the key to this is to check the consent form as soon as it's signed, so that if there are any changes like this that need to be made, you've got the patient with you, and these can be resolved straight away. If there's a missing signature or a missing date or an incorrect date, reconsent if possible, and again, document your attempts to obtain that consent. If there is a missing signature at the end of the consent form, even if all the boxes are ticked or initials, that consent we cannot count as valid. So it's really important to have the missing signature from the patient or the legal representative and the site staff member obtaining consent. If there's an incomplete name at the top of the consent form, the patient or a staff member can amend this retrospectively and initial and date the change. If the wrong version of the information sheet has been used, again, reconsent so that it can be clear on paper that the patient has the correct version of the information, and document attempts to obtain that reconsent. If the original consent form is not in the site file, please locate and file it, and a copy should always be uploaded or copied into the medical records. If the consent process, so not just the form, but the process that Aisha and Beren have talked about, is not in the medical records, please record it retrospectively as soon as possible. Or if too late, please complete a file note to explain why it wasn't documented. A patient's participation may end early in two ways. One, if a study treatment needs to be stopped, or a patient wishes to stop a particular study treatment, you please ask them if they consent to ongoing follow-up and data collection, and then document the reason for the discontinuation in the source. The ECRF needs a consent event to be entered. And then you can continue follow-up and data collection in the ECRF as usual if the patient has consented. Or a patient may need to be withdrawn from the trial, not just treatment, but also all aspects. So again, document the reason for this withdrawal in the source, complete a consent event in the ECRF. The study treatment should be stopped unless this can cause harm to the patient, and this should be determined by the treating clinician. Follow-up and all data collection should be stopped, and the patient's data will be locked in the CRF at that point. So information on all consent events into the ECRF. There are instructions in a worker instruction that Baron talked about earlier, and I think Aisha will touch on in a bit, and our ECRF completion guidelines, which are available on the resources tab in Spinnaker. So all consent discussions relating to participation in the trial must be entered into the ECRF, even those that have no decision or outcome. And a separate entry must be made for each consent event. So actually going to the third bullet point here first is easiest. You may start off with a professional legal representative giving consent, and then you need to carry on trying to get a closer consent to the patient's own consent. So maybe the next day a relative comes in and they may give a written consent. That also needs to go into the CRF. And then when the patient regains capacity, you may end up possibly with a verbal consent. And then maybe 3 days later, they can provide a written consent. So you may end up with multiple consent versions in the CRF. And then finally, if a patient or a personal legal representative withdraws consent, that would also need to go into Spinnaker. And in the agreements, please ensure that the participation in the domains that they are eligible and have consented for are included in the CRF entry. If consent is not obtained in writing from the participant, you will be asked to provide a reason why.
Okay, thanks, Lindsay. So just back to me for the remainder of the slides. So here we just have a couple of informed consent scenarios regarding incapacitated patients. So one would be where the personal legal representative does not visit the patient in hospital. So as we mentioned earlier, they can still be contacted by telephone and informed about the trial, and a telephone or remote consent should be obtained, and everything regarding that should be documented in the patient records and the ECRF. If there is no personal legal representative available, then we would approach a professional legal representative. If there's a situation where a patient dies before any consent is obtained, for example, if it was a situation where the professional legal representative was not available, the personal legal representative was not available, and the patient was incapacitated, and we went with the option of enrolling the patient because it's beneficial for them to be in the trial before obtaining consent, and then they happen to die, what we would try to do is obtain at least professional legal representative consent. Family would be informed of their relatives' inclusion, though it likely wouldn't be appropriate to ask consent given that they're dealing with the death of their relative. And as per the sort of UK ethics, it's fine to use the data that's been collected unless there is a personal legal representative that perhaps says or explicitly says that they do not want the data that's been collected thus far to be used. Again, if a patient remains incapacitated throughout hospital, then we try to obtain consent from them when they regain capacity outside of hospital. So within days up to day 180, which is the follow-up period, and any sort of attempts that have been made, even if consent was not able to be taken, the attempts should still be documented. And I think there's a question from Ashley.
Hi, I just wanted to ask a question on the last point. So we sometimes come across patients who have dementia, so they won't regain capacity in terms like they can't really retain the information of the study or understand the study. What we do is like we get an assent from them, and so they are still able to. Some of them are able to complete the questionnaires with us. So you want us to carry on, documenting an assent from them and carry on doing the questionnaires, or whether we should only try doing the questionnaire if they have consented.
I think if I'm assuming that if they're not able to provide full consent, that there is still consent from their personal legal representative.
Yeah, but we should carry on doing the 180-day follow-up for those patient groups, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think there's different versions of the questionnaires which allows a proxy to sort of answer the questions if you feel that the patient themselves is not able to.
Yeah. Okay.
But I guess if they are able to have a conversation, it would be good to inform them of their inclusion. If even if they're not
yeah,
fully,
that's what we do. Like, patient can understand, they can answer your day-to-day kind of questions, but it's really complex for them to understand the study and retain that. So we just like take an assent and we document that in the notes.
I think it would still be in this case if there was only Prolar in place, it would be good.
We do like get a personal legal representative consent. At the same time, we tell the patient that we're gonna speak to your family about your participation.
Okay,
And
that's fine.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's fine. That's the best we can do in that situation. Okay, just moving on to the next slide. So as mentioned earlier, we do have a consent work instruction and an appendix that goes with it, which may be useful as it does list sort of findings or issues with consents and what the site action should be. So whether it entails entering a protocol deviation and some of the actions that we've already mentioned in terms of correcting mistakes or issues with the consent. So that's a useful table. It's a 2-page document, and we'll make that available to sites after the meeting. So some of you may have seen the consent check log, which we do send out periodically to sites, or we've had to do it for various sort of data exercises that we've required for trial management, just to sort of check on consents for sites that we haven't monitored for a while, or when doing remote monitoring. And also, I think following the MHRA inspection that we had last year, we sort of sent this log to all sites to complete at the time. So we will continue to perhaps send these out periodically to sites. It's important that as many notes as possible are entered in the comments to explain if certain issues have arisen from obtaining consent. For example, if there's Prolar consent and there's no retrospective consent, if the patient's died, or if it's because you weren't able to contact the patient after discharge, it would be good to have that information in the comments. This is just a slide to sort of explain when we go for monitoring, what we check. I thought it'd be helpful for sites to just understand how monitors conduct their checks on consent forms. So, I mean, most of this has been mentioned on previous slides as well, but we'll check that it's the correct version and type being used, that all fields are completed, that consent was provided for all the domains that the patient has been randomized in, and that there's correct dates and signatures, and we'll check those against the delegation log for staff members, and to check the prolars are not on the delegation log. We also check that all pages of the form have been filed, not just a single page by itself, and sort of looking at the source notes again, just to see that everything matches up, who the prolar was, who the prolar was, and things like capacity and whatever else surrounding consent should be documented in the medical notes. So yeah, so I think some sites do have a consent statement, I think it's called, or a sort of worksheet with like a checklist of all the consent fields or information. They may find that easier to use than just freehand documenting things in medical notes. And we're happy for sites to do that, because I know some sites also have an eligibility statement. We were also thinking of perhaps creating a template ourselves for sites to use, if that would be helpful, as it would then cover everything that is required and everything that is monitored, and perhaps all the desirable information as well as the essential information that we're required to be documented. It would be good to get feedback on whether sites feel that that would be helpful. As perhaps when you are documenting consent, you can't remember absolutely everything, or it's easy to miss out a point that we might require if we're just doing it from sort of memory, or yeah. So here is just an example of a consent form, and just a couple of mistakes. As we can see, that there's the participant study ID, which is blank. We've got a name that hasn't been fully written out. There's a couple of boxes that have been ticked at the end rather than initialed. And then there's a time missing, but this would be the sort of thing that we look at when monitoring consent forms, and we basically make notes and would include all of this in a monitoring visit report to then report back to site to get these corrected or amended. So it can be lots of little small things. Some things are more minor than others. Do we have any questions about the consent training or the consent process? Do let us know. I think we'll just spend a couple of minutes on these questions before we move on to study updates, and then there'll be a chance for more questions related to any aspects of the study as well. I'll just check the chat, Ashley.
Yeah, sorry, it's me again. Is it all right to strike through the if we have a patient and we already know they are not eligible for the dexamethasone corticosteroid domain? Is it all right to strike through the the side effects of dexamethasone, or when we give the PIs to the family member of the patient?
So at the moment, I think we do adapt the consent forms as much as possible for the site options. But then, yeah, I understand if they're not eligible for all the. I think if you know in advance, then it's fine. If perhaps it would be useful if there was maybe an initial and a date next to it, so we can sort of see who has done the striking. Is it the patient because they don't agree, or is it the staff because they know the patient isn't eligible and they don't want to provide that extra information to the patient? Yeah.
Yeah, I know in the ICF we already got that option to strike through, but it's just the information sheet also we're giving. If it looks good for the patients, that we're not asking them to agree on everything. When
I think as long as it's initialed and dated, I think we just don't want any changes where we can't track them, we can't track who it's done by, or then it makes it more difficult for us to know at what point it was crossed out, and if there are any mistakes, then it just makes it easier if there's an audit trail.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So there's a few people in the chat who have said it would be useful to have a standardized checklist for consent documentation. So that's definitely something we can look into. We will be sending out the link for the meeting and sharing the slides. Any other questions before we move on? I think we're okay to move on to the study updates. So at the moment, we have 61 adult sites recruiting to flu. I think there's a couple that are in setup as well. And in the last 2 weeks, we've had 6 flu patients. I think since perhaps September, October, we've had approximately 10 patients. So that just takes our total up to 189. So yeah, so it looks like flu recruits are picking up in the last couple of weeks. And I think Tony, our CI, has said that there were more admissions recently as well. So we're also planning on submitting a substantial amendment. So this will be substantial amendment 42. And this will have updated patient information sheets and consent forms. The sponsor had sent us a sort of a master template, and I think they're just trying to standardize templates across all countries. And we've sort of tried to change the language a bit, make it a bit more lay, and just make all the PISs or the different versions that we have sort of consistent with each other, as they all had the same information but in a slightly different manner. So yeah, and I think we're doing the same for adults and pediatrics, so there'll be updates in both. We've also got updated investigation brochures and summary of product characteristics, which we'll be submitting. And then, yeah, so you should get an email probably later this week, if not next week, about this amendment. Just a quick update on IMP. So we were switching from commercial supply for Baloxavir to global clinical trial stock supply. This hasn't been completed yet, so we'll keep sites updated about that. Tocilizumab is still not available. Again, we will keep sites updated about that. And we currently don't have an update on the plasma stock for the convalescent plasma domain. NHSBT had some sickness on their team, and they told us there were delays with the pilot work that they were doing, or the testing that they were doing with the batches of plasma, but we haven't heard any more information from them. When we do, we'll let sites know, as we know there's a few sites that were wanting to continue with that. We also have e-training logs now, so training logs on the website, which can be just completed online rather than having to download the Word document and complete a paper form. So these are available on the website, and I've put the link in the slides. Just to show you, I've just screenshotted the website just to show where it is exactly. So this is our website. So if you go to sites and then go to training for staff, you'll come across this page, which has all the training modules. And then if you select on an individual training module, so for example, the antiviral module, it will have the latest admin guide and slide deck, etc., and the DSA. So if you read and view those materials, you can then complete the e-training log, which is the blue box at the bottom. If you click on that, it will open up a box which looks like this, and you just complete your sort of name, email, and then if you just complete the version training, the version of training, so antiviral version 2.2 or 2.3, whatever it was, and then if you just enter the date and click send, that will then send an email to your email address, and it will confirm that you've completed the training. We then need you to forward that email to us, because that will be filed in our TMF as confirmation of your training, and you'll need to print a copy of that for your ISFs, as that will be basically the log of your training. Yeah, so that's it really for study updates. And then it would be good if we could complete a training log for attendance of today's consent training. If you could just log it as REMAP CAP consent training with today's date, and then we'll just file those. And if you could file a copy of those in your ISFs as well. Yeah, and just, is there any questions about the study, unrelated to the consent, or any other aspects? Any issues that we've come across recently?
There's a question in the chat, Aisha. Lauren is asking if they can still use paper training logs, or is this a complete switch to the electronic versions?
think it's still fine to use the paper training logs. If you find that easier, that's fine. I think if we just make sure it's the correct version of because I think the paper training logs have all the document versions sort of listed at the top of the page, if I remember. So if we just check it is the correct version, we can continue to upload those under the training section in the website, which is separate from what I've just shown you, if that's easier for you. But you can always cross-check just to see that it is the most up-to-date version. Oh, I think we've just got a message from Sarah Edwards to Lindsay about you're going to email in a while about Spinnaker and Leicester Royal, I believe. I'm just going to stop the recording.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, you can start recording. Yeah, I just wanted to sort of mention to everyone who's joined the call, if there's any sort of sessions you'd like us to focus on each month. I think the plan is to sort of hold these webinars each month. As we've just focused on consent today, if there is a particular topic you'd like us to focus on for next month or subsequent months, let us know. And even into next year, you know, we can focus a session on data entry or any other sort of topics that you're you'd like a bit more support on.